Remember, diversity is very important because if you don't have it, you're going to be less viable to deal with the environment. Let's talk about that idea. Remember, at the population level, this is where we're at right now. We talked about molecular and all kinds of sub-organism structural diversity. We talk about genetic diversity, which ultimately leads to species diversity. And we also now talking about population diversity. So this is within the same species, there's got to be variety as well. And that's the whole idea, because populations can be too small. And the reason for that is that, remember that the more variety you have, the more tolerance you're going to have to changes in the environment. Because if you have different animals, maybe one is okay with living in a colder environment than the other. So if all of a sudden the world gets colder, that doesn't mean the species is going to die off, because there's some members of the species which are able to cope with that cold. And that's why some species have higher tolerance than the area that they actually live, and they actually get to be moved somewhere else. We talked about this before. So the idea is, the kangaroo, for example, has an optimal area where he likes to live. That's his niche. But that's his realized niche. That's where he actually lives. But he can live somewhere else. His fundamental niche is bigger than that, because there's variety within the species which allows the kangaroo to live in other places. This means that the more variety you have, the bigger your fundamental niche is going to be. The more possibilities you have in your species. You know, the more variety exists, the less likely a population is to suffer at the hands of sudden environmental changes. Let's look at the human race, for example. If everybody was susceptible to HIV, and HIV was airborne, right? All of us would die in a few matters of few generations. Luckily, it's already been identified that there are some people that can't catch it. And this has been true for every single virus that we saw out there. There's always some sort of mutant that lacks something that the virus needs in order to do what it needs to do. And because of that, that person is immune. But this only happens because people are different from each other. So the greater the difference that exists between people, the greater the amount of variety, the greater the chance that evolution is not going to erase that species. More likely that that species will change over time rather than becoming extinct. So that population diversity leads to greater differentiation of niches, which means more tolerance, which means more likelihood of species to be able to cope with environmental changes and therefore survive the evolutionary process on the long run. So again, variety very important for life. Variety also exists at the community level, and this is where different populations are interacting with each other. So we're starting to get higher up in the evolutionary, on the ecology levels here. Now, community diversity is important for maintaining the complexity of the ecosystems, because ecosystems are based on the interactions that exist between living things. Remember, producers, consumers, and things like that. So if you don't have diversity, you can't have those complex relationships like competition, predation, herbivory, symbiosis, facilitation. All the things we've talked about before on the community ecology lecture series, they wouldn't exist if there wasn't a lot of community diversity. So the greater amount of community diversity, the better things are for the ecosystem, considering that everything in the environment is interdependent, that the things depend on each other. Recall that when we talked about ecology in the first lecture series on ecology, we talked about the fact that the more diverse an ecosystem is, the better it is for the food web to sustain changes in the ecosystem. Because if things like invasive species or extinctions or changes in the ecosystem to the amount of nutrients happen, food webs which are more diverse are more likely to have less cascade effects and change and kill everybody because of one little change that happened. We talked about the fact that, say, for example, if one of these organisms die, like, for example, the robin, that would affect a little bit of the parasitic wasp over here, but it would affect the food web less on the food web A, because there's other animals which are eating food web. It's not, the robin is not so important. There's other options that that other animals can go by in order to get their energy. So the more complex a food web is, the more likelihood that the ecosystem, the community, will survive changes such as invasive species, extinctions, or changes in the ecosystem that mess with the amount of nutrients or productivity that occurs. So this is another example of how the interdependence relies on the diversity of ecosystems. Diversity is also important at the ecosystem level or biome level. Ecosystem diversity, it has everything to do, like we just talked about, with the strength of the ecosystem to sustain change. So that means that ecosystems like the rainforest or the coral reefs, which are very diverse, have a higher likelihood of surviving destabilizations than other ecosystems which do not. Even the abiotic factors, which are interacting with biotic factors, will remain more stable among ecosystems which are very diverse. This is a term that we call ascendancy. It's kind of like tolerance when we talk about species. We talked about that just 2 seconds ago. But at the ecosystem level, ecosystems have tolerance too. As the world changes, ecosystem's chance of survival depends on how diverse it is. So if you have this huge forest with lots of kinds of trees, and a forest fire happens, the likelihood that 10% of the trees will survive is good. But if you have a smaller ecosystem and 10% of the trees survive, then that's very few trees, and the likelihood of the ecosystem bouncing back from that is going to be very, very low. So ecosystem diversity is also important to maintain the ecosystem stability in the face of change. All right, kind of like animal tolerance in the face of change. And then biome or biosphere diversity is also extremely important, because the planet being diverse actually helps the planet as a whole. And just look at the way that the planet's diversity helps humans, for example. We constantly are finding new medicines from different kinds of plants that we find in things like the rainforest or all kinds of environments on Earth. If it wasn't for the fact that those plants existed because of the diversity of life, we wouldn't have all these new kinds of antibiotics and antifungal medicine, which is helping us survive disease. Also, a lot of the technology that exists today is inspired or based on discoveries which were made on Earth, and sometimes even rely on tools which come from nature. Also, the environments help regulate the climate of the world. We talked about on the extra climate lecture series the fact that the life on Earth actually changes the climate. Life produces greenhouse effect. Life produces water vapor. Life affects the amount of energy that's actually absorbed. The sun is absorbed more if there's a lot of life in there, because the trees will actually pick up the sunlight and absorb much of it. And so that energy is going to be affected by the life's presence. So climate regulation is part of what life does for the world. So if you change the life, you're going to change the climate of the world. Ecosystems also purify the world. They recycle the air. They make sure that the toxins and things like that are removed in the environment. Without life, those toxins will accumulate in the soil and other things like that. And there's a lot of examples in biology where scientists have been able to use living things to help clean up the mess that humans made. For example, in oil spills, there's special bacteria that can work with that, other kinds of toxin spills. Also, for pest control, it's important, because when you have less diversity, you have less predators to keep the pests at bay. And so what starts happening is you guys get a lot more pests destroying our food because of the fact that diversity levels are low. The soil richness and a lot of other types of things in the ecosystem, the soil that we need to cultivate, all of that is a factor of the diversity as well. Many cases, when you don't have diversity in the ecosystem, the soil's value goes down. Like, for example, if you cut the rainforest, all the nutrition of the soil ceases to be there. So as you see, diversity is important even at the biome level. Now, in the next video, we're going to talk about how scientists measure diversity and some of the threats that exist for it and what limits the diversity of ecosystems.